cheap solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles are changing the transport and energy sector as we know. I bring in guests to this podcast who will help you with their ideas to navigate this energy transition. Thank you for joining. Hi, good evening, Massimiliano. How are you today?
Very well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm in Manila. Where are you today?
In Abu Dhabi.
Abu Dhabi. Fantastic. Maybe for our listeners, I know you have a very broad experience in a different region that we don't know much about. Maybe you can introduce yourself first, who you are, what you've been doing. Thank you.
Yes, I am Massimiliano Cervo. I work for Alvarez and Marsal as a manager in the infrastructure sector, specifically in the energy sector. I'm a member of the board of the Energy Institute of the Middle Eastern branch. And I also collaborate and work with the World Energy Council and different energy agencies when it comes to peer reviewing final roadmaps or energy strategies.
Fantastic. So you have been working on energy transition, right? Fair bit. Tell us a bit.
Yes. So along all my career has been based in the energy sector. I'm a chemical engineer. I did an MBA and I'm now finalizing my specialization in project finance. I worked in Europe, the Americas, have some experience in Asia Pacific, actually, when I was studying at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. And now I'm based in Abu Dhabi, but I have experience and exposure over the last couple of years to the Middle Eastern and the GCC market.
And there's lots happening in that market, no, in terms of innovation and energy and new technologies.
So, from my perspective, the Middle East is diversifying as much as they can. They're still one of the key in the energy sector and in anything related to infrastructure, you name it, from mining, energy, they're expanding a lot and growing massively. Now, after ADIPEC, the energy strategies are being reshaped globally. It's not only applicable to the Middle East. I think that the energy transition now is looking more into a regional and local approach rather than a global approach.
Can you expand a bit more on that? What you mean?
Yes. So what I believe, and this is just my perspective, the energy sector has been following a roadmap that it was replicating a more generalistic and global approach. Let's all go and implement the same technologies doing the same business model with the same structure. And I believe that now, with a world that is highly fragmented, some might say deglobalizing actually, I believe that there's going to be a reshaping of the energy strategies. I believe that electrification is going to be the key pillar, but all of the strategies are going to set priorities instead of addressing all of the pillars of the energy trilemma. The energy trilemma consists of energy security, energy access and affordability, and sustainability. I believe that the priorities will change. We were trying to tackle everything at once, and the markets are now choosing to let's first guarantee energy access and supply, energy security. Then let's make it affordable, and then let's make it sustainable. I believe that every region, if they already have energy access, they're going to focus on making it cheap. And if it's already cheap, then they're going to make it sustainable. But I believe that's where the world is going at the moment.
But that's for everywhere else. For the region that you are in, it's sort of outsiders looking in always would say they have access, not an issue. Energy security is not an issue. I mean, the traditional energy sense, and affordability is also not issue, being a very high per capita income in the region. So these issues that you mentioned, that applies to developing Asia in a way, no?
Exactly. Now, in the region that we are in, I have a different approach to it. And it's the same to any country that it's not a net fossil fuel importer. If you consider the GCC as one of the key pillars of oil and gas, one of the best regions for oil and gas, together with the US Gulf Coast, I believe that for these kinds of countries, for every megawatt hour that we install locally as renewables, is 1 megawatt hour of oil and gas that I'm saving and that I can export. And so it's sort of the model that Norway had implemented, using the revenues from fossil fuels to decarbonize their existing operations. So I believe that's what the Middle East is looking for, to be one of the leaders locally in renewable space, and obviously activating the economies through LNG and natural gas, which will be most probably the transition fuels.
But when we look at Saudi Arabia and the region and overall the Gulf region, they were the one breaking solar PPA records, right? I mean, not now, but 5 years back, all the cheap sub 2 cents, sub 1 cents were coming from that region, right?
Exactly.
That strategy was to meet domestic needs, whereas they continue to be the lowest cost fossil fuel producer and they were maximizing the export of the oil at the same time.
Exactly. And that's why you also see now so many international investments in energy, because I believe that LNG will be, if not already, the transition fuel, or a fuel that is going to have more and more attractiveness, even in the maritime sector. In the maritime sector, I believe that there's going to be a lot of diversification, not only LNG, but also considering methanol, biofuels, blending. And this applies to the region, but again, my approach is also global. I believe that in the energy transition, or at least in the next 25 years, the key is going to be diversification. I don't see a one solution fits all, a silver bullet that you can implement and it's going to help us solve all of our problems. On the contrary, I believe that the best companies and the companies that will be better positioned are the ones diversified and that are not relying on one supply.
One technology, you mean? Yeah.
Exactly. One technology or even one supplier of one fuel. For instance, China is a key importer of LNG, and they already mentioned, look, we don't want to be reliant on just one fuel. We're going to try to diversify as much as we can to avoid potential supplier shocks, volatility prices, etc. And that also helps you from an energy security.
Yes, yes. I mean, that's what IEA used to do, right? The core work initially just to manage the energy security global is sufficient to. Now, in terms of project, what type of projects are happening in the region if we dive a little bit more within the energy transition? I know that the tons of investment have been going on, no?
Yes, there's a lot of investments, both locally and internationally. The UAE and Saudi and are investing a lot, both locally and internationally. We saw it with the native deal in Vaca Muerta, where they actually invested on LNG in Argentina. And we also see that from a local perspective in their pretty ambitious targets on doubling down on the transmission networks, grid networks, integrating their grids as well. So there's going to be a lot of investments for specifically the midstream, because this is, again, not an issue locally. I think that this is something needs to be addressed in most of the regions. We've always promoted a lot the generation side, but we never promoted as much on the transmission and the grids and distribution assets and integration. And the latest IEA report shows it pretty clearly that one of the bottlenecks that we might be facing in the next 5 years is going to be actually transmission lines, injection queues, and injection penalty, basically.
Yeah, well, that will depend on how much of embedded storage one can have into the grid. You are a chemical engineer. I'm sure you have a strong view on that also, no?
So I do believe that we do need flexibility. If you analyze what happened in Spain, it was an eye opener for us all on the fact that we do need to start focusing on storage, on flexibility. The higher the renewable penetration, we're going to have to install more storage capabilities, whether it is through lithium ion, vanadium flow, but we're going to start to see that this bottleneck, as you said, can be solved also through storage. And the UAE particularly is doing a lot of investments in these giga scale projects for energy storage and also for renewable generation as well.
So, I mean, is there any specific giga scale project that you can talk about?
So one of the key projects that it was public, it was announced by Mazda investing in a partnership for developing a solar PV plus lithium battery storage facility. It's going to be gigawatt scale. And this is going to be a real game changer for the UAE and also for the renewable energy sector, because again, to make this happen, we're going to need economies of scale. We're going to need large scale and giga scale projects, not only for the cost to go down, but also to do an integration, a higher penetration of the renewables in the grids, basically.
Do you have any indicative prices for those projects? What sort of prices on a cent per kilowatt hour they were looking at?
So I cannot speak in particular for any project, but the lowest PPA in the region reached a couple of years ago, it reached 11.50 cents per megawatt hour. It was one of the cheapest ones. Now, when you bring that into IRR and NPV terms, you see that this is a very low IRR project. And I believe that's why we are thinking on this business model on, as the margins are lower when we speak of low carbon projects, let's decarbonize as much as we can, and let's focus on the return metrics that we want with oil and gas. And I think that's the model, again, the Norwegian model. And I believe that's the model that is being implemented and promoted internally here.
Yeah, I mean, $11.50 a megawatt hour. So that's a 1.5 cents, sorry, 1.15 cents a kilowatt hour. So
Yes.
sort of, I think, still one of the lowest.
That was one of the lowest projects ever achieved.
Yes. But then again, I don't know what views you have on hydrogen, because it needs to be even 75% lower to make hydrogen viable. I think quarter cents a kilowatt hour. So we are way above in the. Do you have any views on the hydrogen?
So my views in the hydrogen space have evolved along my career. At the beginning, I was pretty optimistic on the decarbonization pathways. What can a molecule offer an electron cannot? Now, when I put that in the context of having worked and built hydrogen projects, that perspective shifted to, let's use hydrogen where it makes sense and where it can be implemented in an economically way or to meet compliance targets. And I'm going to provide a bit more detail on that. I produce hydrogen as a molecule, whether it is from electrolysis or steam methane reforming with carbon capture, or even conventional hydrogen with any, independently of the color that we're considering. You can burn it and basically generate heat for processes. You can put it in a turbine, inject it in a turbine, and this will generate electrical power in a fuel cell as well. Now, you can also use it as a feedstock. So if I want to produce synthetic fuels, or let's not get into the matter of synthetic fuels, any hydrogenation process will require hydrogen, whether it is for petrochemicals, chemicals, etc. So why do I want to mention this context? If I go to the power market, I have a lot of competitors. That's why the importance of the price is it's not only critical for the project and bankability, but also from a perspective of who are my competitors. I'm competing. If I'm speaking of conventional, I'm competing with natural gas, diesel, biofuels, which are cheaper alternatives. If I speak of renewables, I'm competing against solar and wind, which are much cheaper alternatives. If I speak in terms of energy storage, I compete against pumped hydro. I compete against lithium ion, which are again much cheaper alternatives. However, if I speak in terms of a mandate similar to the SAF mandate, the Fuel EU mandate, the IMO framework for bunkering fuels, just as a couple of examples, and I develop a mandate where I say, look, hydrogenation processes or these chemical processes need to have X amount of reduction in their carbon intensity. There is no other option but hydrogen. For hydrogenation processes and for chemical synthesis, you use a lot of hydrogen. And that's where I believe it makes sense for a direct use. So we don't need to transport, we don't need to distribute it. So we are reducing our costs as much as we can. We don't need to invest in storage. We're using it directly for hydrogenation processes. I think that in those cases, with the right policies in place, with the mandates, it makes sense. Now, on the other cases, I think that the market is still pretty much immature. We are celebrating not meeting targets. And it sounds a bit harsh when I say it this way, but we celebrated 1 million tons low carbon hydrogen. But 1 million tons in 92 million is nothing that impacts the energy systems at all. And I think that's a lesson learned for all of us. Use hydrogen where it makes sense. Use hydrogen in the processes where I have no other alternative. And one of the latest studies from the International Energy Agency was speaking about it in the latest executive brief that I present for S&P Global Commodity Insights. They did an analysis of what would be the impact of 100 or 200% green premium on hydrogen, which is the green premium that we have today. What would be the impact on the end user? Not speaking of B2B, speaking of B2C. What's going to happen if my levelized cost of hydrogen is $7 per kilogram, but I use that hydrogen, for instance, for producing green ammonia? Green ammonia would have a cost premium of 200% as well. But if I use ammonia for fertilizer, fertilizers have a green premium of 140%. Now, if I take that 140% of fertilizers and I use it, for instance, for food supply, for preservatives, for food, the impact in the food industry is less than 0.5% coming from an ammonia that has a price of $1,200 per ton. If I consider a green premium of 200% in green steel, that's a lot, actually. If I were a construction company, I would say, look, this is a lot if I'm considering the green steel itself. Now, if we consider building an airplane or building a car, more than 70% of the parts are plastic. It's not actually metal itself. It's not steel. It's considering EVs, for instance. The impact of a 200% green premium on green hydrogen for decarbonizing steel production and manufacturing a low carbon car, it would have a cost impact of 9% on an electric vehicle. It's a green premium that's, depending on the country that you're living, it's almost twice the inflation of a year. I think it's a premium that people might be able to pay. Now, if you go to the other end, to the other extreme, and look at it for decarbonizing, for instance, ships, containers, let's think of a ship that it's already producing 20% less emissions because it's powered by LNG. And I still use green hydrogen for the metals of the container ship. That green premium is a lot, yes, from a steel perspective. Now, the impact on bulk transport of the smartphones, for instance, in container ships full of smartphones, it would be less than 0.5%. What I want to say is basically, as a conclusion, that we need to think, we've always thought of pushing a product. People don't want green hydrogen. We want it to happen. So, quoting Steve Jobs and quoting Jeff Bezos, you need to look at it from the market need. You need to look at it from what's the final problem that I'm solving for my end customer? And what's the impact that it's going to have on their pocket? And reverse engineering on how do I deliver that product to them? So again, would I be willing to pay 500% more on an electricity bill in order for it to be low carbon? Perhaps not. Would I be willing to pay 10% more, 15% more, 20% more? Most probably, yes. And I'm quoting one of the latest surveys done by the energy agencies where most of the people are willing to pay up to 10, 15, and up to 17% green premiums in order for it to be low carbon. So we need to find a way of, perhaps through vertical integration, through JVs and partnerships with different parts of the supply chain in order for us to not focus on how my green premium affects the other buyer of the fuel, but how can we do a vertical integration and understand how that green premium will diversify itself to production units that will end up adding to 5% to the end user.
That's actually a very good point that you make, that while the green hydrogen price itself might be 200% more, the total impact on an electric vehicle, if it is 9% based on the sort of steel content, that is a more palatable number than the 200%. That gives people a jerk, right? The shock, right?
Exactly. That's why I was telling you, comparing it with fuels, we're going to lose, or we are losing at the moment, because LNG is cheaper. If you consider an LNG Arab price around 11.50 per MMBTU, hydrogen would be above 32 if we do it green in the equivalence. So it's almost double and triple the price of conventional fuels. That's why I believe that for power purposes, today the market is not there, but we do need to find which applications we can decarbonize. I read a very good paper a couple of months ago on producing low carbon pharmaceuticals. You power the facility with renewables and battery storage. You use recycled plastics and you have sort of a circular economy for the plastics and all the waste. And also for the chemical synthesis, you use green molecules, low carbon molecules. The impact in pharmaceuticals, again, in those cases is less than 7% because you don't use 1 ton of hydrogen for one ibuprofen tab, for instance. And you don't use that much of a plastic for a blister. You don't use that amount of plastic for the bottle that you use for handing out the pills. So in those cases, the green premium is something that the end user could potentially afford. It's not doubling, tripling, or even quadrupling in price. Whereas in the fuels market, if I want to burn hydrogen, I have cheaper alternatives. And it all comes down to, I'm getting sort of theoretical now, but it all comes down to doing a market entry analysis. It would be the same thing. If I want to push hydrogen into the energy sector, I have cheaper alternatives. Now, if I want to push it down to decarbonize a supply chain where there is no other competitor, again, through mandates, the right policies, etc., even with carbon pricing, you can have a business case for it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess same argument could be applied to sort of cement manufacturing and other similar approach, right?
Exactly. Exactly. So I thought that study done by IEA was really spot on. I'm actually lecturing in a couple of universities. One of the universities that I have been lecturing for the past 5 years now is the National University of Technology in Argentina, where I developed the hydrogen economics program together with Natalia Catalano, Javier Cinquini. At the beginning, it was just Natalia Catalano and I. And when we developed the coursework, we were thinking on what's the approach to making hydrogen feasible. And if you look at the program, 70% of the applications is looking into the chemical sector. How much hydrogen do you use for hydrogenation? How much hydrogen do you use for making or turning olefins into light molecules? And when you think about it in those terms, again, that's the business case that I see for it in the next 15 to 20 years. That's why I spoke a lot about diversification. Think that there's not one solution fits all. And I believe that was the issue that we had with hydrogen. We were trying to push it into the market instead of looking to where the demand is actually pulling. If you look at the demand pool, it's 90% of the demand is refinery, petrochemical, and synthesis processes. So that's sort of the business case for it.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a very nice analysis there. So obviously, if we are not going to burn hydrogen, then of course it doesn't make sense to go for a hydrogen car because it's quite an expensive exercise, and it has been proven almost everywhere by now. What's your view on that front versus fuel cell cars? Do you have any views?
So recently, one of the examples is if you look at what happened with the train, Coradi Island, is getting out of circulation. That's because the cost was higher than expected. I believe that hydrogen as a fuel, perhaps for heavy duty, might make of a business case. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of my reasoning behind it. One of them is, let's think of it this way. If I buy green hydrogen at a pump, I'm 100% certain if it's certified, that was produced with renewables. And my emissions is only a bit of steam. If I buy an EV, and I drive a hybrid. If you plug it in, where's the electron coming? I'm burning fossils to reduce my carbon intensity in my car with electricity. So I think that's one of the things that, unless the grid is decarbonized, driving an EV has its carbon emissions as well. On the other hand, Angela Merkel was one of the leaders that was behind this idea. If you look at the fuels, the fuel sector, most of it is taxed. And how do I tax fuels with the EV chargers? That's a bit more problematic if people are charging their EV at home, etc. So I think that in some countries, they decided to move with hydrogen for two purposes. One, on ascertain that the electron is green. And also I can tax it. I can tax the fuel and collect. And also because of autonomy. Me, as a person that doesn't use the car for driving 300 km, 400 km, 500 km, I believe that an EV with a fast charger is okay, or even a hybrid. Now, when you think on a larger scale, for instance, for heavy duty transport, the space that batteries take up is space that I cannot carry load. Not only that, but also weight of the batteries takes up less load that I can take on a heavy duty truck. And the same applies for ships. So in those cases, I do believe that perhaps we're going to need some sort of a molecule. Again, could be LNG, could be a biofuel. Look at Brazil, for instance, bioethanol. Bioethanol is great. It's proven to work. Now, you can have there sort of the discussion and argument that some people have on feedstock limitation. Some countries are going to have to import the biofuels. And on the other hand, if it comes from sugar cane, maize, etc., you have the food supply also. People are complaining a bit about that, and it makes sense. So that's why I think that this transition, it's going to be much more complex. And I heard this several times. I don't like to mention sort of phrases that might seem done by ChatGPT, but it's no longer energy transition. It's energy addition. And that's where I believe that most of the markets are going. Look, let's start decarbonizing what we have of new capacity, and let's diversify as much as we can. But I believe that this approach of one silver bullet is not going to be sustainable in the long term. At least that's my point of view. And that's why specifically for maritime, for bunkering fuels, etc., we're going to need mixes. And in the power sector as well, we're going to need everything we can in order to meet our targets, because we put so many limitations that we have some countries that even stopped chasing their net zero targets. And we want to avoid that. So my perspective is, instead of doing nothing, I'd rather have you doing something than doing nothing. So again, anything that we can do to reach our targets, whether it's through LNG, biofuels, carbon capture, or even electrification, I welcome.
Yeah, I mean, having said that, if we look at the marginal abatement curve for those technologies, I think they are way lower on the sort of lineup. Yeah. I mean, there's so much room for energy efficiency and solar. I think electric vehicle was quite high up on those first generation of the marginal abatement curve. I'm not exactly sure where hydrogen fuel cell car fits into this, because your example of taking a truck, I think a sort of levelized cost of operation on a, I don't know, ton per kilometer or something. If you take the total deep cost of hydrogen sort of infrastructures and others, a lot of subsidies needs to come in, no? Otherwise it won't happen. And if it's subsidies are handouts, of course, fossil fuel industry will not be there today if there was no subsidies, right? Prices will be through the roof in a way. In many cases, electricity will be unaffordable in many ways, right? So in many places. So I don't know. I mean, it needs a lot of thinking as to if the government going to give a handout, how do you allocate that, right?
Yes. And also, what I think, if you look at all of the energy transitions, and this is something that I'm very passionate about. Whenever we discovered a new source of energy and we tried to implement it, you can call it industrial evolutions, etc. They took between 50 to 100, 150 years for the technologies to mature. If you consider the first industrial revolution around the year 1700, 1800s, etc. When you look into those numbers, we are quite anxious now for decarbonizing. I don't know why, but I want it now. We are asking to reach our targets and accelerate our targets. And we want a new industry to be feasible in 10 or 15 years when it took others 100. Not 100 per se. Let's use an example with LNG.
I think the world is a different place. You know, during COVID, the vaccine got developed so fast. In the past, it has taken 50 years to come up with those sort of solutions. The tech that we have, the communication that we have, the analytical ability that we have. So I don't know. I mean, I personally think that historical conclusion may not be very relevant going forward, because the way the tech is moving and the way you and I are communicating for free with the video and the bandwidth, this was unthinkable when industrial revolution has happened. They would have taken a ship 9 months from Australia to UK on a boat, right?
Exactly.
We cannot compare with that world with today's world, though.
We cannot, but we can do some extrapolation again with LNG. If you consider how long it took for LNG to be feasible, it took 40 to 50 years.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
And we're asking hydrogen to deliver it in 10 or 5. And if you look at what you mentioned before, at the marginal abatement cost curve, I believe that the story is pretty much straightforward. The cheapest tons to reduce are the ones that are going to be prioritized. And as you said, it's going to be energy efficiency and mature technologies, renewables like solar and wind. There's so much to be done yet in energy efficiency. Now, I really liked one of the latest studies from Bloomberg, where they showed a chart and they broke it down into two in the second slide. In the first one, you saw that the energy transition technologies or low carbon technologies are booming and investments are increasing exponentially. And then they broke it down into which sectors, and they split the chart into two: solar, wind, hydro in one, and nuclear in one chart. And on the other one, you have hydrogen, carbon capture, etc. What you see is investments in solar, wind, nuclear increased year over year, whereas compared to the last 3 years, investments in hydrogen, carbon capture and storage declined. And I believe that, again, it's all about the costs per ton of CO2 avoided. cost per ton of CO2 avoided with hydrogen, with carbon capture and storage is still too expensive. That's why most of the investments that we see in the renewable space come from solar, energy efficiency measures, and also upgrading transmission and distribution. Now, yes, hydrogen is a different story. It's still at the expensive end of the cost curve, and it still requires a lot of infrastructure and investment for it to grow at scale. And again, for heavy duty trucks, it might make sense from a technical basis. But when you put it from a total cost of ownership and a bottleneck cost, it's still much more expensive than driving with biofuels or with even an EV. It's still much more expensive. That's why I think that, as you mentioned, those solutions will require policy support, such as carbon prices, mandates, contract for difference, or even direct subsidies. The problem with subsidies is somebody has to pay for it. And again, to be honest, the fossil fuel industry have been subsidized for decades. But we forget that when we speak about subsidies. In some countries, it had a lot of support. 2022, the total subsidies for global oil and gas was around 7 trillion. It's a massive figure.
That's a big number. I think we have done almost 50 minutes of conversation. We can continue forever. I mean, I think we'll come back.
Yes.
We've been very resourceful. What else do you do for fun? I think we have been working too hard. No?
So, for fun, I love spending time with family, with my dogs. That's why they're barked at the moment. I enjoy weightlifting.
Wow.
I do weightlifting a lot. And one of the few people that you might meet that can tell you, and my wife can vouch for it, I lecture for fun. I really enjoy lecturing, keynote speaking, these sorts of interactions. I do enjoy them a lot because I'm really passionate about the energy sector and the impact that it entails. We are energy. Everything is related to energy, and it's one of the pillars of the global economy. Again, to me, these sorts of interactions are really valuable, and I do it for fun as well.
That's good. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate that. I learned quite a bit on the details on the hydrogen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I look forward to participating more often.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Energypreneurs. To continue listening to this conversation, please visit us at Energypreneurs. Thank you. See you next time.